political analyst and someone we love, an incredible attorney. We have Ben Meiselas on the show today. He has been instrumental when it comes to covering politics, part of his Midas Touch network, which covers politics live, real time, and really giving us the truth in what is happening and not scared to answer the hard questions. So let's recap a little bit, Ben, okay? So at this point, we know that President Biden will be completing his current term, which will go until the top of the year. And Biden shocked literally the entire world by saying that he will no longer be running as the Democratic nominee for the upcoming presidential elections. And he also endorsed his current vice president, Kamala Harris, as the nominee. Okay, so Ben, can you explain to us why did President Biden make this decision?
Well, just think about it from the perspective of your listeners and viewers here. If you were having the most powerful job in the world, that you worked your entire life for, you literally reached the pinnacle of the world. I mean, what position higher than the United States presidency? And obviously with that is going to come some ego, and usually a ton of ego. So to make that decision, just put yourself in that position, is truly an incredibly selfless act. And, he's accomplished, in my opinion, more than any modern president over the past 3.5 years, if you just go and look at his policies. But, let's face it, all the media was talking about nonstop was his age. And for me, with age comes wisdom. I don't know people who look at Star Wars and take a look at Yoda, who's old, and go, you know what, Yoda's an idiot. So in my view, age usually means wisdom. But in our TikTok virality world, every piece of news was on Biden walking slow or Biden stuttering. I didn't like that, but that was the reality. And I think what Biden realized is if people keep talking about that, there's not going to be information out there about what's at stake, which is Project 2025, which is what Trump and the MAGA Republicans want to push on people, taking away your freedoms, the mass deportations where Donald Trump wants to order local police to round people up, knock on doors, pull people out of homes who look a certain way on day one, take away women's reproductive rights, which Donald Trump has done by putting people on the Supreme Court who are Trumpers, right-wingers, who said that they would do that. Next, they're coming for IVF. They want to attack women at every step of the pregnancy. Before, take away their rights at IVF, and then take away their reproductive rights through every single stage. And just look at their voting behavior. You don't have to say, oh, Ben, you're being hyperbolic here. Look at what they actually vote for. And the positions that I said are consistent with what they've said in their voting behavior. So President Biden made the decision, look, I got to pass the torch. And he selflessly passed the torch. And I think it stands in stark contrast. You have Donald Trump, who selfishly tried to cling on to power when he lost by millions of votes and got crushed in the last election and led an insurrection. Just contrast that selfishness with the selflessness of President Biden passing on the torch to a younger generation and in an incredible person in Kamala Harris. And you've seen the energy. It's unprecedented, I think, in American political history, what we're seeing right now.
Is there any truth that President Biden was pushed out by other members of his party from big-time donors?
Yes. Absolutely. And they made no qualms about it. There was the debate. Biden had a very bad debate. By the way, Donald Trump, I thought, had a bad debate, too. He lied the entire time. But let's face it, Democrats have different standards for their candidates than MAGA Republicans. Donald Trump can invite Hulk Hogan to a convention who rips off his shirt and goes, oh, yeah, I'm Hulk Hogan. And they like that. The Democrats hold their candidates to different standards. And even though the polls post-debate were actually showing that more people had a negative view of Donald Trump after the debate because they got to see him again, the Democratic Party was like, we can't have, President Biden. He's a liability for the future debates. And you had leadership there. people like Nancy Pelosi and major donors out there who, who put their names out there publicly, and they not only they withheld funds from the campaign, and every day they went on the news and there was a new announcement. This Democratic person didn't said that Biden should drop. This person said he should drop. This person said he should drop. They
Yeah.
recognized his accomplishments, but that cascading effect was ultimately kind of too much. And then President Biden over the weekend said, you know what, like, this is not good for the country. And so we can't win this if you're literally going to tank me as a candidate. And so rather than put the country at risk, he made a move that I think will go down in history as like that was a pretty impressive, selfless freaking thing to do.
You analyze politics day in, day out. What are some important accomplishments that Biden was able to achieve during his term that maybe people overlook, or at least we should remember as the upcoming elections roll around?
Look, there was a lot of trauma when Trump was in office, so I know we want to have collective amnesia about what took place, but ask yourself, where was your toilet paper when Donald Trump was in office, and where is your 401k now under Biden and Harris? To me, it could be as simple as that, but then you could look at any one of these other categories. There's over 40,000 infrastructure projects because of the Infrastructure Act, because of the Inflation Reduction Act. President Biden's brought down inflation. Now, inflation doesn't rise out of nowhere. Like, we have to, and sometimes it's easy to place blame, but like, let's remember, Donald Trump added close to $9 trillion in debt. The way Trump bankrupted his businesses, that's what he did to the country. And then he printed all this money recklessly, the same types of crap he does with his businesses. And that's the cause of inflation. Like, it has an origin somewhere. Like, when it rains, you don't just go, it rains. I mean, you can, but you may want to say, wait a minute, how did that cloud formation form? And you don't just have to take my word for it. In the Republican debates, when Donald Trump was too scared and refused to debate against DeSantis and Haley, the Republican candidate, said Donald Trump added $8 to $9 trillion in debt. That's where inflation came from. So Biden could have went around whining and saying it's Trump's fault. It's Trump's fault. He didn't. He did the Inflation Reduction Act. Economists predicted a 100% chance of inflation. Have your listeners Google Bloomberg, 100% chance of inflation. They left no margin for error, and we were not in a recession. That doesn't mean that things were great the first few years, but you hire leaders to fix problems. That's what you do. And you don't blame the firefighter, you blame the arsonist. So you have to think, who's the one who set that fire? And then if you want to talk about things like, the PACT Act, over 1 million veterans have received life-saving care right now because of an expansion of veterans' health care that they wouldn't have got because of President Biden. Student debt. I know lots of listeners, whereas the Trump plan is, how do we help billionaires? How do we help the richest of the rich get richer? What President Biden says is, look, some of this student debt stuff has held people back in their ability to buy homes and get cars and live their lives. So I want to focus on regular folks, not the 0.001%. And so that's why he targeted his debt relief at people who were making below certain amounts of money. And so you can go on and on and on through these, through these issues, but he was always focused on, hey, these junk fees are bad. How do we deal with that? Non-compete clauses are preventing workers from getting other jobs. Like, while Donald Trump's out there saying MAGA, MAGA, and making our politics into this WWE cosplay fascism, Biden's actually been on the front lines doing stuff. And so what made me upset is that when someone came in there and did the job without flash and pizzazz, but did it, and people were just attacking the age and not focusing on the policies, I was out there saying, yo, he's done what you wanted him to do. Like, there's limitations to the power of presidents, but he did what you want. And I get that he's old, but let's not be ageist. But look, where I'm happy now is because now people are focusing and recognizing his accomplishments, and they're focusing on the future. And that's why I think Kamala Harris's vision is a future-focused vision of what do we do to advance this country versus, this focus on the past or litigating Biden's age. By the way, Trump's 3 years younger. So to me, it was like, what are we even talking about?
I want to stay right there on Biden's term. What would you consider a failure of his? And it doesn't have to be him specifically. It could have been because there is limited amount of power within his presidency. And what would you consider a failure for the Biden administration?
They failed to communicate what they were doing, I think, to the public based on this conversation. And I think, the fact that your viewers and listeners probably don't even know all of those
No.
accomplishments. And then I think
don't.
one of the failures also was, how do you deal with the border in a way that treats people with dignity? This is the United States. We should treat people with dignity. But how do you also recognize that there is a border, and you can't just let everybody in, but you have to also be cognizant of asylum claims and people, if you send them back, they could be killed in their home country. We don't want to separate kids and have them live in cages from their parents. So it's a difficult issue, but he tried to address it with a bipartisan deal. He allowed a Republican from Oklahoma to lead the negotiation. They then reached a deal, and then Donald Trump killed the deal because he wanted to run on chaos at the border. So if you go and look at the Midas Touch YouTube, you'll see videos where we show Donald Trump out there bragging about how he killed the bipartisan border deal because he wanted chaos. So there's been lots of times where President Biden's tried to do legislation and it's been blocked. The George Floyd Policing Act. President Biden's done what he can do with executive orders. He's pushed for advances to make sure that police are held accountable. But then you also have to recognize the reality of that has to pass in the House and the Senate. And right now in the House, it's controlled by Republicans and Trumpers who are even taking their own immigration bill that they wanted for all of these years. And look, Biden was trying to get some aid to Ukraine when things were going really bad for them. So Biden tried to compromise and said, okay, you've been saying you want this at the border. I'll give you that. But we got to help. We got to help what's going on in Ukraine. And then the MAGA Republicans refused to do it, and they destroyed it. So, I think those are his failures. And then and then one of the things that he'll say, and he said it before, when you talk about what's gone on in Gaza, President Biden warned the Israeli war cabinet about the experience we had in America post 9/11, where we took 9/11 and then focused not on the targets of the terrorism, or as President Biden said, focusing on Hamas, but we then brought in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan to other areas outside of Taliban and Osama bin Laden. And that's why those American wars were failure. So President Biden didn't have the ability to control a very far right-wing Israeli war cabinet, but very early on he did give them the warnings and the issues there. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump and his ilk, who quite literally talking about leveling Gaza cavalierly, in their speech and in their things. And so I also recognize that that's been a real issue, especially among listeners of this program, about how President Biden's dealt with it. But he's actually tried to deal with it for the position of someone in that position, given the historical alliances with Israel. He's tried to deal with it, but ultimately where you have someone like Netanyahu who's in power, who's basically Israel's Trump, there's limitations on what you can do. I mean, when Netanyahu's coming here to the United States, the first person he's going to try to meet with is Trump, because he's trying to interfere with our election to help Donald Trump, because he thinks, the Trump thing is going to be, helpful for him. So I think we also have to recognize that Israel's not a monolithic thing. And the voters in Israel actually don't really like Netanyahu. And he's engaged in the same type of behavior there that we're warning people that Trump's been engaging in to avoid accountability.
So I want to talk about this, and tell me if this is true, if it's not. The latest that I saw is that current Vice President Kamala Harris will be the official Democratic nominee running against the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. Is this official, or are people still waiting until the DNC?
Well, it gets confirmed at the DNC. So she
Okay,
has
so,
gotten the
okay.
commitments, and then it's made official at the convention. Where so at those conventions, like the purpose of them, now they've kind of become kind of PR stunts to showcase the up and coming leaders and all of this. But the purpose of it was the delegates from different states show up, they travel, and then they cast their vote for a specific candidate. So she's locked up the commitments that she needs, then it becomes official at the right now it's presumptive, then post it's like official. But she is the presumptive Democratic nominee.
So people notice, and there's different articles, that notable names from the Democratic Party who did not immediately endorse Kamala Harris right away as the chosen Democratic Party nominee, obviously former President Obama. And that stuck out for a lot of people. Now, the latest that I saw was that Senators Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries now endorse Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee. So with this going on, and it feels like there was a lot of think pieces behind this, why did they not initially come out and endorse her?
I mean, I think it's strategic, to be honest. Like, I think
Got it.
that if they all announce their support on one day, then each endorsement loses its impact. So just think about it from a PR perspective. If Obama gave his endorsement, it would just be on a list of things. And I think if Obama kind of stays back, watches, and look, there may be something to it that he is. Look, I'm not saying it's all PR stunty. He could be sitting back and saying, "Well, look, I just want to see, what these speeches are going to be like before I'm a former president before I cast an endorsement." But I think Obama knows the power of his words, and that it will be a full day story when he makes that decision. So if he waited until the convention, say on day 3, the whole story is Obama's endorsement versus him as one of many.
So at the DNC, that's really when people go back and forth trying to become the nominee, the chosen nominee, right? And so right now people are saying, oh, like they want to skip over that process, or do you get what I mean? And they're just trying to
Yeah,
get to
yeah.
the
I mean, look,
point.
there's something called a contested convention, which is very rare, where there is infighting taking place, and then all these delegates show up, and you don't actually know who your nominee is, and there's a real fight, and no one knows the outcome of the vote. In the past, when
Right.
that's happened, it's been absolutely disastrous. That's not going to happen here. What's going to happen is it's a rubber stamp. It's ceremonial because you know that she's going to be it, the same way people knew Donald Trump was going to be the nominee. And
Right.
so it's really just a showcase of the unity. And then over the course of different days, the Democratic Party showcases different leaders, and they tell a story about who they are. So my anticipation is you'll see some of the new young Democrats, you'll see some of the new members of Congress, you'll get speeches from Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. You'll get a one night Obama will probably highlight. Everyone's going to be waiting for the President Biden speech, because just think
Oh,
about
yeah.
that. Think about that event when he passes the torch officially to Kamala Harris. And the priorities, I think, will be different. So the fact that Kamala Harris is polling ahead of Donald Trump right now, and she's just been announced for 2 days, and she's surged ahead in the polls and the momentum. Just think about it, where the Democrats showcase now for 4 days. It'll be like the most watched convention because everyone is so intrigued by this. And then they're going to talk about the issues about what's at stake here: women's reproductive rights, freedoms, Project 2025, that MAGA Republicans want to do mass deportations and fire anyone who's not purely loyal to Donald Trump. I mean, look, Nessa, Donald Trump is on tape saying he wants to be a dictator. He says, I want to be a dictator on day 1. He says it. And then he says, I want to be a dictator just for one day. And then you'll have people who go, Ben, but he was joking. And I go, you think in our politics, dictatorship is an area of humor? Like, I don't, even if I accepted the humor argument, that's not funny, you know, where people's lives and freedom is on the line. And if you're telling me it's a joke, that should be disqualifying. There's nothing funny about it. And I think Democrats are going to showcase that contrast that we're seeing now.
With your analysis and seeing the excitement behind the campaign, behind Kamala Harris, and how much money was raised for the campaign, are you optimistic? Are you taking it easy? Are you monitoring? Where do you land in this? What does this tell you that she's been able to break records with how much money she's raised for her campaign?
Tells me people want a future focused vision. And what they were frustrated about, and they were both sidesing the issue, is they looked at Trump and Biden as two old white men whose vision wasn't in the future. And I think there was a big contrast between them. But I think, especially, you know, what their records were, as I said earlier in the interview, but I think President Biden realized that he was becoming an ineffective messenger based on the way it was being both sides. So what I think is happening is with the energy of Kamala Harris, people can reflect now with a sober lens on the accomplishments of the Biden-Harris administration. And I think people on almost a bipartisan basis, because I don't really consider MAGA to be real kind of Republican. I think mainstream Republicans to very liberal people are saying, you know what? This is a ticket, this Harris and whoever her VP is, that's going to be about the future. Climate change is real. Donald Trump says climate change is fake. You know, we have to restore women's reproductive rights. That was 50 years precedent. We can't allow this radical right Supreme Court controlled by minority rule to take away the rights of people. Look, the Voting Rights Act was gutted because the Supreme Court said there's no racism in America anymore. When I say the Supreme Court, 6-3, it's controlled by 6 right-wing Republican justices who have said racism's good, we're done. You know, we are in a world where even focusing on racism is racist to white people. It's what the Supreme Court said in their ruling, and they've gutted the Voting Rights Act as a result. So we need a future-focused vision that restores the rights, that protects the freedoms, and advances things into the future so that our future generations, you know, can do well. Like, you know, to think about, you know, our kids and our grandkids and the world that they're going to be living in. You know, one of the most frightening prospects is a world where someone like Donald Trump, who's been found liable for sexual assault by a jury, where Trump was too afraid to show up to the trial, so he went to Scotland and Ireland and hid, where someone who's on audio tape, like Donald Trump is, bragging about sexually assaulting women. It's on an audio recording of him saying that. Donald Trump is on an audio recording bragging about having beauty pageants so he can look at naked girls without their consent, because as the owner, he can inspect them. Donald Trump has given statements to magazines like New York Magazine saying that Jeffrey Epstein is a good guy who likes women on the younger side. Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Everything I just said is an undisputed fact. And it is a scary prospect for future generations and current generations to have somebody like that with the nuclear codes.
Can you explain the connection between what's been happening amongst the Supreme Court justices, right, and the president? Because I think sometimes people don't understand the important correlation between the two and what that has done and how it's impacted us.
Okay, Supreme Court justices are appointed by presidents. They're confirmed by the Senate. So it requires a two-step process. So when former President Obama was in power, he tried to appoint a Supreme Court justice, but Mitch McConnell, who controlled the Senate, refused to allow for Obama's appointed judge or justice to even get a day where there was confirmation. So, and everybody thought, well, look, Hillary Clinton's going to win. So whatever, we won't deal with it then. Hillary Clinton has an 85% chance of winning. So, and then the voter turnout wasn't there. Trump takes over. Trump gets to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, one the vacant seat that Obama could have had, and then 2 others. And remember, you had the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, right around the 2020 election as well, during that cataclysmic 2020 year. So Trump appointed a very right-wing guy named Neil Gorsuch. Donald Trump appointed a female Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, and Donald Trump appointed a guy, Brett Kavanaugh, all very right-wing. Then you have Clarence Thomas, who was already a very right-wing Republican justice. You have Samuel Alito, who flies upside-down flags, which is like one of the insurrection symbols, who's on the Supreme Court justice. Clarence Thomas, who's been paid, bribed $4 million by billionaire Republicans who have horrific ideas. And then you have Justice Roberts, who was also appointed by George W. Bush. So you have 6 right-wing Supreme Court justices, and then you have 3 liberal justices, but to me, they're just people who are enforcing what the actual law is. So in any Supreme Court decision, it's a vote. You should be notable that when President Biden had the opportunity to pick a Supreme Court judge, he picked Ketanji Brown Jackson, African-American woman, and President Biden's appointed more diverse federal judges to the bench than any president in history, like by multiples. So in that dynamic, it's a vote. Whoever votes more, if it's 6-3, if it's 5-4, but now the Supreme Court is a super majority right wing. So they work hand in hand with right wing groups. Like you've heard about the Federalist Society and these other groups. And what these other groups do is they file lawsuits across the country dating back 10, 15 years, because cases can take a really long time sometimes to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. But these groups manufacture the lawsuits to then send them up to the Supreme Court. And they file them across the country, hoping that they get other right-wing judges who will expedite it, because first you have district court, then you have appeals court, and then you have Supreme Court. So they try to manufacture these cases, a case that basically says you can discriminate against gay people. And like the facts of the case don't make any sense at all. It's like some business in Colorado that claims that they're like doing wedding photography, but they've never done wedding photography businesses before. And they create a website, and then someone mysteriously sends a note to their website that they want to have a gay marriage, and they're looking for the photographer, and the photographer goes, no, our religious rights say we're not going to do it. And the whole story is like total BS. And like, it turns out that the person who even sent the email is just like a random person who was straight. And so, but they manufacture these cases, work them up to the Supreme Court, and they do this with LGBTQ rights. They do this with voting rights. They do this and they manufacture them. They find a doctor who says, my faith won't let me do abortions, so I need to, I'm challenging that. And then they bring all of these cases up. They bring people who have gotten debt relief for $15,000, but they want $20,000. And so then they sue Biden for that. So they have all these people bring shady lawsuits that work for the right-wing groups. They get them to the Supreme Court, and then the right-wing Supreme Court rules with their right-wing agenda and screws over everyday people, and they rinse and repeat that over and over again. And if you think about politics like a pendulum swinging, sometimes this side, sometimes that side, what they've tried to manufacture is holding the pendulum now on the right, on the conservative side, which I don't even consider conservative. I consider, frankly, like fascism at this point. And they want to hold it right there and not let it even swing back, because they know if you bring these issues to the American people, reproductive rights, climate, gun control, you name it. Americans aren't divided. They're dividing us. 75% of Americans agree that climate change is real. Let's deal with it. Agree with common sense gun reform, a deal that women should have their reproductive rights, agree with student debt relief, agree with, wages being increased, not to a minimum wage, but to a real living wage, support unions, support the environment. So why do we get these policies that don't reflect what the people want? And it's exactly what I said and laid out there. And people need to know that's the hustle. That's the game plan. That's what they do. And then they blame the misery, the Republicans do, on Democrats. And then they go, oh, these liberal communists, and they use that. And people are suffering. They're not paying attention to the news because they're living paycheck to paycheck. And all they hear now is a divisive demagogue, governor or former president, pointing the finger loudly. And then they have right-wing media push these messages out every day, and they divide us. And we shouldn't be divided. We should come together. And that's their hustle that they do over and over again. And there are billions of dollars being poured into that system that I just discussed.
With that being said, I saw on your program on the Midas Touch Network that articles of impeachment have been presented against Kamala Harris. What and why?
I think they did some sort of resolution. I don't think it's articles. I think they did some censure resolution. They're calling her the border czar and that she's causing issues at the border. Look, MAGA Republicans, you voted against the bipartisan border deal negotiated by James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma. You torpedoed the Oklahoma Republicans' immigration bill so that you could whine about the chaos and then blame Democrats for it with performative stunts like this. And so, look, I'm not trying to say, Nessa, that the Democrats are perfect. I'm not trying to say that I think everything Democrats do are great. I'm not saying I'm trying to root for in this is not even a person. I just want someone who's providing actual solutions and giving me data versus trying to divide us and be all weird about it. And like, why are these Republicans handing out AR-15 pins and fetishizing, these weapons of war? It's like, look, we could agree that the Second Amendment's important. Like, no one's saying that there shouldn't be common sense, like, gun ownership, but weapons of war by schools, like, what are you doing? Keep that away. And, I had someone on my program who was a marksman instructor, a guy named Adrian Fontes, who's actually now the Secretary of State of Arizona. He showed me the booklet, his marksmanship booklet, when he trained military officers on how to use the military version of the AR-15. The training manual was like 5 inches, 6 inches thick of training to use the weapon. So now that it becomes a civilian weapon, you don't have to go through the training that the military has to go through. Like, stuff like that, that's not, to me, a democratic position. I like to believe that these positions that I'm talking about are common sense positions, but we can't get caught up in the circus that people are trying to create, corporate media, right-wing propaganda, just regular corporate media that tries to divide us by making these into horse races. And my frustration about the whole Biden thing was Biden was not a good horse race candidate because they were focused on his age. An old horse can't run the way the young horse can run. Mm-hmm. But what they should have focused on was, okay, what are we better off now? Can we report on, policy? And they never did.
Can you explain a little bit about people questioning Kamala Harris's apparent problematic history as a prosecutor while in California? What is that whole story? And then what are the facts to it?
I mean, she was a prosecutor. She started her career actually as a sex crimes prosecutor, prosecuting people like Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was found civilly liable for sexual assault, not criminally, but people who were engaging in that conduct. She would do, she did prosecutions like that. She became the main prosecutor in California. She was the attorney general. And as the attorney general, I think what a lot of people kind of put on her with the criticism is, I think, also the way I went through the process about how these cases work their way up to the Supreme Court. I think there's also like a bit of a civics lesson on the way these cases work. Like, as the Attorney General, she's not really day to day in the courtroom like she was when she was a line prosecutor prosecuting people. She sets a vision. And also, when she prosecutes people, she's not the one responsible for the sentencing. The judge ultimately is the one responsible for the sentencing. She prosecutes people for whether they did it or didn't do it. That's quite literally the job of the prosecutor. Now, it's the job of lawmakers, if you want to do reform, sentencing reform, that's not the prosecutor's deal. The prosecutor has to go within guidelines, and they say, here's the sentencing guidelines, here are the factors, and they have to follow the law. They can't deviate from it, because then they violate the law as the prosecutor. So I think the criticism that is, I think, that is well intentioned is, hey, there were a lot of people who were prosecuted for high sentences, and did you go too far on these cases? And my response to that was, as a prosecutor, she's not the one making the sentencing determinations. At the end, if we want to deal with that at a systemic level, we should talk about things like the George Floyd Police Reform Act and things like that. And then we also have to acknowledge, who is it that is killing these bills from being passed, and look more systemically. It's easy to say she did this, she did that. But I'll tell you, Nessa, her being a prosecutor to right now and prosecuting the case against Trump is the perfect person. Like as a counterpoint to Trump, a convicted felon, you have a prosecutor. And so there could be other moments in a historical zeitgeist where that dynamic lends itself to, I think, maybe deeper kind of convos. But here, I think having a prosecutor versus the felon, and her laying out the case, Donald Trump's a predator, Donald Trump engaged in this, Donald Trump's a fraud, he's a phony, he's a convicted felon. There's no one better to, like, it's a strength, it's a plus. And I mean, look, a lot of, also look, I think there are very well-intentioned people who have real justifiable criticisms on the sentencing issue. So I don't want to downplay that. But I also want to kind of give the counterpoint, as I did in some other controversial, in some other controversial issues and topics we talked about before, which is that doesn't, on the other side, what the other side wants is some of the most horrific things that you could ever imagine. And we can have civil discussions and real negotiations and petition the government with one group of people. And with the other group of people, they're gonna tear it down, and they're gonna demolish your freedoms. And that's what I think we have to keep in perspective.
I want to stay right there, because I really want it clear. What do you believe will be the most important policies that are going to be on the line this upcoming election? And then where do Democrats and Republicans land on those topics?
It couldn't be a bigger difference. And as I said before, with Donald Trump saying he wants to be a dictator on day one, Donald Trump laying out policies with mass deportations, Donald Trump celebrating Roe v. Wade being overturned, taking away women's reproductive rights, Republicans voting against bills that would codify contraception, voting against bills that would codify IVF treatment. They may tell you something else, but they're hustling you. Just go look at their voting records. They voted against IVF. They voted against contraception. Just think about that. And they voted to, they vote against these things that are, and then they go and they look you in the face and they go, oh, no, but that's just because the Democrats went too far with it, because they lie about all this crap. It's one big hustle and fraud over and over again. As I said before, I think you ask yourself, where was your toilet paper under Donald Trump? Where's your 401k now? The MAGA Republicans and the media can try to sell you that there is misery. But look who is out there threatening the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who may be lowering interest rates soon. Donald Trump threatening the Federal Reserve Chair not to lower interest rates because Donald Trump thinks that will help the Democratic candidates. Like, what person roots against America's happiness? Donald Trump stopped a bipartisan immigration bill. What person does that? For Donald Trump, there's no policies anymore in the Republican Party, Nessa. It's not like I could tell you, here's a conservative ideology. What are they even conserving? At this point, they've replaced American flags with MAGA flags. They've replaced the national anthem with the J6 anthem. Remember all of this? All these MAGA Republicans who were lecturing us many, many years ago about the flag and about the anthem? They changed the anthem. They have it sung by January 6th insurrectionists. They changed the flag. They put Donald Trump on the American flag and they fly MAGA flags, not the American flag. So my point is, there is no position that they have. Their position is whatever Donald Trump says or tells them to do. Nessa, Donald Trump is selling $299 assassination edition sneakers. He took that event and he is selling assassination edition shoes for $299 a piece. 5,000 of them. He autographs 10 of them. What psychopath does that? Like, just think, that's the person who's going to have access to the nuclear codes. Like, that is a crazy person. And you contrast that to a future looking vision of Kamala Harris. And I will certainly appreciate a civil conversation about, will she go too far on this issue? Will she go not as far on this issue? But her issues will still be fundamentally American issues that has stability, predictability, and that we know that we're not going to wake up in the morning and see all caps posts of Donald Trump, whining every morning. We're going to go about our days. We're going to have disagreements on issues. We're going to have strong disagreements on issues. There could be protests against some of her policies at the White House. We will engage in these processes that are cherished under the First Amendment, but we'll have our First Amendment and we'll be able to deal with these issues versus this isn't a scare tactic. It's just look at the things that Donald Trump is saying. And when it was Trump v. Biden, people weren't looking at it because they were focused on Biden's age versus his policies. So now people can focus on, oh crap, what? He's selling assassination edition sneakers? What? He's posted 2,000 QAnon memes, a death cult? He just posts QAnon memes. He goes into churches and starts cursing in churches. He goes into high schools and talks about golden. I know it's a distasteful topic to talk about on a program, but Donald Trump goes into a high school and talks about being urinated on by hookers. He spoke in a high school about that. For me to even have to mention that is ridiculous. He talks about that on tape. He goes into a church and leads a chant of the words BS with kids cursing. And he rents out a black church in Detroit, fills it with white MAGA followers, then crosses the street where they're holding up signs and wearing hats that say white boy summer. Like, none of this should be normalized. And then he talks about his relationship with Hannibal Lecter, a fictional cannibal who he calls the late, great Hannibal Lecter, who eats your brains. And he says that in his speeches. And he'll go, hey, have you heard about Hannibal Lecter? The late, great, he'll eat your brains. And it's like, what are you even talking about? So this is, and how I built this network and why we have 2.61 million subscribers, why we get 20 million views now every 48 hours, why there's been this shift to us is because you would think the things that I've just said are being talked about elsewhere. I sure hope it will be in the future, but for all of these years, it wasn't, and it's been a lonely battle talking about these things. And now I feel with Kamala that the cavalry has arrived, and we can be like, oh, yes, here's what it is. So that's kind of a relief for me.
If you were part of Kamala Harris's campaign, what do you believe her campaign should focus on?
What they've been doing right now has been, I think, pitch perfect. prosecutor versus felon, future forward versus Donald Trump has old racist ideas, and then I think you're not afraid to call him out as a convicted felon, as a predator, as Epstein's buddy, who's all over that list, and you just have to call it out. I mean, he was, and it's a fact. He's in the depositions, he's on the phone logs, he's on the plane logs. He wished Ghislaine Maxwell well, the person who trafficked for Epstein. He said, I wish her well when she was in her trial. Like, what a sick thing to say. So I think that she's going to prosecute the case against him. And I think also simple is better. Sometimes one of the problems with the Biden campaign is they would rely on all of these detailed policy memos, which as a policy memo geek, I enjoyed all of that, but I think it was hard to get to the American people that data. So I think she needs to focus on things like, remember where your toilet paper was, know where your 401k is right now. Look, Trump is threatening mass deportations. Listen to him. They had signs at the RNC. The sign said mass deportation now. They said send them back. And that means local law enforcement knocking on your doors, rounding people up, separating families, separating children. Could you imagine the trauma that'll be cost to our country on day one? So she's just got to, she'll say it like that over and over and over again, and I think she'll do well. And look, when it comes to the Midas Touch Network, one of the things that I'm often asked is, are you concerned that your messaging is politically slanted? And I have an easy answer. I go, absolutely not. I said, I interned on the Hill for a little bit, but being an intern's not really working in politics. And then I learned to dislike politics. And Nessa, my background. I really wasn't a political person. I was a civil rights person, not a political person. And then I stepped into politics in 2020, but then I realized I actually despise the politics of it. And I'm not trying to fanboy on people because people will always let you down. What I want to focus on is the principles here. And if I can stick to these principles and values, and if we talk about those on Midas Touch, we can transcend the split screen, both sides fight that corporate media puts on, and we could be above it, and we can say, hey, that's bullying, that's bad. Hey, that's racist, that's messed up. Hey, that's not cool. Hey, oh, that's a good idea. And the moment we do that, we bring people together. And when we bring people together, that's where the real dialogue begins. And I think when we start talking in terms of you're a progressive, you're a conservative, you're a liberal, you're a right wing, we're already creating artificial divides. So the way I frame things is, are you part of this pro-democracy, pro-normalcy coalition? Or are you with this MAGA, whatever this MAGA Trump thing is? And let's be pro-democracy. And then once we protect our democracy, we could get into normal political discussions again and have those differences. But with all the things I listed about Trump, this is not a normal political time. And this is not Mitt Romney versus Obama. This is not McCain versus Obama. This is not George W. Bush versus John Kerry. Go back and look at George W. Bush speeches and you'll be like, whoa, that sounds kind of normal, which is the craziest thing in the world to even think about. Because I remember being in college when George W. Bush, listen to him talk about immigration, where he talks about how important the Latino community is, where he has nuanced views and how America is a country of immigrants. And you go, wait a minute, at the Republican National Convention, you didn't have George W. Bush, you didn't have Mitt Romney speak, you didn't have Paul Ryan. Wait a minute, Donald Trump's own vice president didn't speak, his own Mike Pence, because Donald Trump encouraged people to hang him. Like, maybe a red flag is that almost no one on Donald Trump's cabinet wants to work with him, and they all say he's a threat to democracy. His own people.
What is at stake this next election that, Ben, we all need to take serious?
Your freedoms are on the line, period, full stop. And that's not hyperbolic. It's not hyperbolic. You saw what the Supreme Court did in overturning Roe v. Wade. You'll see what the Supreme Court has done with the Voting Rights Act, where they've gutted it. You see what the Supreme Court's done by eliminating precedent regarding the separation of church and state. The Supreme Court has declared that Donald Trump can have the powers of a dictator. They ruled that he's entitled to absolute immunity. Trump's lawyers said, we think that he should be able to allow SEAL Team 6 to kill his political opponents. And the Supreme Court responded, yes. That's such a crazy concept to me as someone who went to law school, that you said that the Constitution, which was quite literally created as a response to monarchy, as a rejection of absolute immunity that kings had, that a president is a king. And so these issues are on the ballot. Your reproductive rights, your access to IVF, your access to contraception. If there's someone listening from the LGBTQ plus community, your right to love the person that you love, your right to vote, your right to, to exist. And again, just listen to Trump's rhetoric, listen to what he says. And what we just try to do in the Midas Touch Network is play the clip. I go, play the clip, play the clip,
I know.
play that clip, play that clip. And so listen to it. And I don't try to chop the clips to give them, improper context. I give it the full context. And if you want to have the horrific task of watching these speeches the way I do, go for it. Watch them like I do. But I try to watch them so you don't have to.
Who would be your dream ticket? Not what you think will happen, but what would be your dream ticket?
It really is the people who are on her list. Like, look, I think you can add like a dream ticket would be, Kamala and Gretchen Whitmer could be incredible.
But people are saying because it's two women, that's going to be hard. I think it's, hey, why not? Why
you
not?
Asked for my dream. Yeah,
stand?
Exactly.
Like why not stand on it?
Yeah. You asked for my dream team, but I think that, but look, Gretchen Whitmer, like my dream team is about 4 or 5 people, like Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, the governor, Andy Beshear from Kentucky, Gavin Newsom from California, Roy Cooper from North Carolina, Mark Kelly from Arizona, Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation. That's a great group right there. Like any one of them would be my dream team. Gavin's from California, 2 California people, doesn't make sense. Gretchen Whitmer's from Michigan, I think,
which is a swing state, right?
Swing state, very popular. But so I think, you've got Mark Kelly, astronaut, who's a senator from Arizona, like an astronaut. Like every kid wanted to grow up to be an astronaut. Imagine the astronaut versus like J.D. Vance, who's like talking about diet mounted. Like J.D. Vance, Trump's guy's like the weirdest dude ever. Like Trump picked the weirdest individual. So Trump picked the worst because the tech bros told him to pick J.D. Vance. So you put the astronaut against this weirdo from Ohio and J.D. Vance, who fakes growing up in Appalachia. The guy fakes growing up in Appalachia, works in Silicon Valley, then goes back to Ohio, starts a sham charity where he claims he's helping the opioid addiction there. He only funds a researcher who works for Purdue Pharma, who literally is funding the research of OxyContin while he claims to be helping it. Like he's the worst phony dude. And J.D. Vance, Trump's own VP, said Trump's America's Hitler. Trump's own VP said that about him and then changed his whole personality to become the VP. So you could have an astronaut against him. Josh Shapiro is another prosecutor. So you have 2 prosecutors, Josh Shapiro, Attorney General. So you have 2 prosecutors prosecuting the case. Shapiro is just going to crush J.D. Vance in a debate. It would be awesome. And then Roy Cooper. But I think it's between Shapiro and Mark Kelly.
And final question, I want your perspective on this because I've seen it come up multiple times, especially from young people. Their concern with Biden, the Biden administration, and how he has handled what's been happening in Gaza. And just recently, there was an article right here that was on The Guardian, and it's saying 7 major U.S. labor unions call on Biden to shut off military aid to Israel because of the humanitarian crisis happening in Palestine, and that people are concerned about this humanitarian crisis. And this is big news. And for a lot of people who have been following the news, a lot of the Democratic constituents expressed how they don't want to support Biden or his administration because of the financial military support that's been providing aid to Israel. And speaking of Michigan and Gretchen, this was clearly on display in her state of Michigan with many uncommitted voters. So, with this new information coming in, Ben, of labor unions sending this letter in to President Biden, expressing their concerns, unions are horrified. This is from the article that our tax dollars are financing this ongoing tragedy. Do you think this letter will shift the Democrats? I don't know, I guess the road that they're currently on? Do you think this helps Democrats, doesn't help them? And what does this mean for the uncommitted voters in general? A lot of people are, I've heard this rhetoric that they don't want to vote. They don't want to have to vote between Biden, and they don't want to have to vote between Trump. And now in this instance, Vice President Kamala Harris, if truly she is, will be the Democratic nominee, they don't want to have to pick between the two. And what do you say to them with this information now? And what will happen with the Democrats? Because I do think this is an important point that will be, I think, a determining factor of who really shows up to the polls.
Look, so Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are very similar. Netanyahu is like the Israeli Trump, and Netanyahu is going to go immediately to Mar-a-Lago when he visits the United States. And just be clear what Donald Trump's plan would be for Gaza. Donald Trump's plan would be to take bulldozers, quite literally take everything down, no matter what, no aid at all, and then rebuild like Trump properties and hotels, and to never create a Palestinian state. Like, I just want to be very clear about that. Donald Trump is not supportive of a free Palestinian state. He's committed to turning that property into beachfront real estate property. He said that before. There are people in his administration go, "Oh, we were joking about it." Going back to what I said, that's not something that you joke about at all. Like, President Biden has been working every single step of the way on a ceasefire. One of the more difficult things that he has to deal with is that he does not control the Israeli war cabinet. It is a right-wing cabinet run by Benjamin Netanyahu, but every step of the way, President Biden has done things, including which the Israeli war cabinet has criticized, him for, regarding how weapons are being distributed, how it's being dealt with. President Biden's given the clear warning: do not make the mistake that we made after 9/11. You should go after Hamas, and Hamas is the terrorist group. Go after them. But the moment you're expanding it, it's not, even if you think you've won the war, you've lost the public opinion. And more important than public opinion, you've lost innocent lives, which is a travesty and a disaster to happen. So President Biden, at the very least, for those uncommitted, has a very, nuanced view. And you may say, look, Biden is not going, far enough on the position, but there's a difference where you have American foreign policy. We could have 20 podcasts like this that was traditionally viewed Israel as a very important ally in the Middle East. And then what happens where Israel is in its own way has a right-wing guy like a Netanyahu engaged in this policy where you have to not change your foreign policy in a drastic manner that could cause broader turbulence, in the Middle East. We don't control Netanyahu's government. And how do you grapple with that? And I think President Biden's tried to have a nuanced view. I think with his nuanced view, he's pissed people off, though, where he's not gone, it's like, how do you have a nuanced view when you see these images and you see these photographs? And President Biden's response may have been unfulfilling to a lot of these uncommitted voters, but he says, look, I'm committed to a ceasefire. I want there to be a free Palestine. I'm trying to have a two-state solution. That's what I'm negotiating, and that's what I want. That's my vision for this. Versus Trump on the opposite end of the spectrum. So, it is that dynamic that, to me, it is very different, their views, but they get lumped together, I think, unfairly.
Labor unions are so important to the Democratic Party. Do you think this letter will mean anything to them? I mean, just reading some of the press release where the APWU president said, working people in our unions are horrified that our tax dollars are financing this ongoing tragedy. We need a ceasefire now, and the best way to secure that is to shut off U.S. military aid to Israel. Do you think when labor unions put a letter together like this, knowing, what labor unions mean for the Democratic Party, do you think they will listen?
Look, I think Democrats should look at the situation, setting aside the labor unions. They should look at the situation, and as President Biden says, there needs to be a ceasefire, immediately, in the area. And, I think that is requiring that, that hostages be returned, that a deal is worked out immediately. And that's President Biden's position on it. As in terms of the labor unions should vote its interest. Donald Trump was someone who gutted labor unions. Like, how Donald Trump's doing everything Trump does is a scam. So one of Trump's scams right now is no tax on tips. You know how they're going to use the no tax on tips? When billionaires pay themselves, they're going to call it tips. Okay. And they're going to try to use that as a way to not tax themselves. If you want to look at the way Donald Trump has dealt with the issue on tips and taxes, Donald Trump supported the right of corporations to claw back, when Trump was in office, that he can claw back the tips to the company, can take the tips away from their employees. So you have an actual record. And exactly why is Donald Trump so focused on, no taxes on your tips? And you think about it, it's a weird policy. It's like in the sense of, why would the Republicans be against student debt relief and say that that's unfair if it's targeted at a group, but then look to service workers and now talk about it because they're not focused on the service workers. The first thing they're going to do is screw the service workers and use this as a tax avoidance scheme for billionaires. So you have to be aware of what their hustles are all the time, like that. But labor unions should vote. President Biden's been the most pro labor union president like ever. Like where Donald Trump said he was going to bring manufacturing jobs back, he didn't. President Biden did. President Biden's actually revitalized these communities by bringing clean energy plants, 40,000 manufacturing jobs, bring the semiconductor industry back. While MAGA people mock, the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal is about jobs. It's about building the way the future is actually going to work, and that's employed Americans. So, look, to me, the union should vote in the union interest, and to me, people who are listening to me, should vote, how they think they're going to vote on, when it comes to the issue in the Middle East. I don't begrudge anybody for hearing what I just said and finding what I said objectionable or whatever, but I do hope that the main point is that there isn't parity between Trump and Biden. What Donald Trump's plan would be is the biggest possible disaster ever, with no check and no chance ever of a two-state solution, period. And President Biden gives you that chance. And President Biden talks about ceasefire all the time. You'll never hear that from Donald Trump. That may not be enough. You may never forgive President Biden for what he did, and that's what you have the right to do as a voter. But you should reflect on the fact that you may never have the right to vote again if you elect someone who jokes about being a dictator on day one.
Wow. Can you, and really quick, Ben, sorry, but I just really want people to understand the difference. When we hear about taxes, I don't know if there's this like idea that, oh, Trump's going to make it better. And, the average person really believes that the taxes that Trump is going to, I guess, get passed if he were to be president is more beneficial to them than when a Democrat is in office. Can you explain the differences when it comes to taxes and who really benefits
You know what it reminds
the
me of, Nessa?
most?
It reminds me a little bit of a football analogy, where sometimes people are rooting for the billionaire owners, sometimes over the
Right,
players. And it
right,
surprises me, but there is an allure of these, and I don't view it in these terms, but the badass billionaire who's got the private jets and the women and the this and the that and this and the swagger. Why would I support labor? Why would I support that? Will reflect you're probably labor. Like unless you listening to this are a decamillionaire or a billionaire, President Biden's policy is a bottom up, middle out policy and a tax policy that's supposed to help you. The only people whose taxes get raised under President Biden are millionaires and billionaires, which is why the billionaires rally around Donald Trump, even though I think that's pretty foolish, because it doesn't matter if you get tax cuts if you don't have a democracy. If you want to look at what they do abroad to the billionaires, the authoritarian takes their money right away unless they don't pay homage to him. But it's a whole other conversation that we have here. So look, President Biden's policies are designed to help people who are making 5 and 6 figures up at, really up until that 500,000. As President Biden says, look, I'm a capitalist. I support million. We want a jet. You want multiple jets? Go and do it, but pay your fair share of taxes. Look, Donald Trump, in the taxes that were obtained by Congress, there were many years where he paid $0 in taxes. Zero. And some years where he paid $750 in taxes. So there's a rigged tax code where billionaires can shift assets around and treat certain things as loans, and basically at the end of the year come up with the fact that even though they have all this money, claim they made no money and then not pay any taxes each year. So the fact that a teacher, a firefighter, someone who works 2 jobs, you paid more money than Donald Trump in taxes. And the Trump tax code is designed to help his billionaires. I'm not talking about percentage. I'm talking you paid more dollars than someone who purports to be a billionaire in taxes. Now, if you like that, if you think that's cool, then, and if you think that Trump should have 10 yachts and these billionaires should, be able to, cheat the tax system for themselves and get the loopholes and basically have socialism for them, billionaire socialism, then great. Like, live vicariously through them and let me know how your life is. But if you want to focus on your own life and your family and want a tax code that deals with your reality, not this, billionaire lifestyle that, the tech bros on TikTok try to make us believe is an accessible, world. But we should all have hope that we can get there. That's the American system that President Biden supports and Kamala Harris supports. But I think the system should be fair. And it's not fair when when billionaires behave that way. That's all. I mean, it's that simple. And again, I don't begrudge your viewer or listener if they heard what I said and they're like, well, I like that the billionaires are gonna do it. I like trickle down. But think about this: the very policy that the billionaires support is called trickle down economics. The plan Biden and Harris support is called bottom up, middle out economics. If you go back and you look, was there a recession under Bush? Yes. Was there a recession under Reagan? Yes. Was the economy doing better under Clinton and Obama and Biden? Yes. Was there a disaster under Trump? Yes. Why is that? Because where you trickle down breadcrumbs, that's what trickle down means. So when Republicans talk about trickle down economics, give all the benefits to the billionaires and then hope the billionaires trickle breadcrumbs to the people and we get their sloppy eighths. And then maybe those sloppy eighths that we get, we can buy. Or do you want a policy that gives it to you? Like, would you rather get it, the sloppy eighths, or would you rather get it? That's the difference between the two policies. And the Republicans and the right-wing propaganda media and corporate media don't want you to know that because they know that they're owned by billionaires and millionaires. So they've got their agenda.
Where can people read up more about everything you said? Because I mean, some of the information I was just taken aback from, and I think some people are not going to be able to comprehend that everything that you've shared today, it's because you have the proof, the evidence. You are an attorney. Where can people learn more about what you do? Because you do share insight, you share the clips, you share the audio. You are basically an investigator at the same time, Ben. Where should people go to just keep up with what you're doing and, I don't know, get actual credible sources?
Look, I think that they could watch Midas Touch. They could go to the Midas Touch YouTube channel. They can follow Midas Touch on socials. But I would caution people to get their news from corporate media that does things in sound bites, and because all you get is people arguing with each other, and you don't get the facts and the data. So, and what I try to present on Midas Touch is the raw data. And the more I show you the actual charts and the graphs and objective data, and the less I'm yelling and doing theatrics, the more we can really have a discussion on, on these issues in an objective way. And so I tell people, look, you could use Midas as your first source, but then if you're skeptical and if you think, hey, maybe he's exaggerating, maybe he has an agenda, which is fine if you do, then go and find the primary sources that I cite, and and then go and see if those primary sources are consistent with what I say they are, and and then start asking the questions about why it is that one group seems to lie to you all the time. Why are they lying all the time? Why is it that Donald Trump would say something like, the judge valued Mar-a-Lago at $27 million, and the judge went out of control judge. Donald Trump valued it at that amount of money. Why did he do it? Because he didn't want to pay taxes on it. And if the property was 27 million versus 1.8 billion, he saves 9 figures in property taxes.
Ooh.
So when he's out there saying that, he's relying on a laziness of you to go, oh, this judge, of course Mar-a-Lago is worth 1.8 billion. Look, property's not worth 1.8 billion. It's probably worth 300 to 400 million. That's a lot of money. Great work. But why are you claiming it's 27 million? All the judge was writing in that opinion is what you said it was, because you wanted to pay less money on property taxes. You paid $1 million in property taxes versus 100 million in property taxes. So the moment you start to unpeel those layers, you start to open your mind on the hustle. And the hustle is coming from a group of people that want an outcome. And the outcome that they often want is that the billionaires, an oligarchical class, get the benefits unfairly and don't have to work as much as you do. And that, to me, is what we are very much focused on.
Are you going to amp up the coverage this cycle as we get ready for the presidential election? Because the coverage that Midas Touch already does is incredible. So I don't know if you're going to be able to sleep at all, but are you going to be amping up the coverage all day, every day at this point?
We're expanding and acquiring other YouTube channels, Gen Z channels, channels focused on pure law, true crime channels. We're broadening out what we're doing there. And look, I'm going to come on here more and speak to your audience, and because I really want your audience to be motivated to take these interviews and then share them.
That's right.
And take them and share them and just let people know, here's what's happening, and then let them judge for themselves.
You shared so much information today, and you're an attorney, so you always cite your sources. So for a lot of people who are listening today who might be taken aback by the information that you shared, again, on your network, you cite all of your information, you have all the data, and that's really important. And you share things that corporate media doesn't necessarily always cover, and I know that's important to you. Ben Meisalis, thank you so much. Incredible political analyst and attorney. Thank you for keeping us well informed. Thank you for giving us the raw data of what is happening in politics and not sugarcoating anything. And whether we like it or not, thank you for sharing the facts at all times. We appreciate it so much, and we can't wait to stay in touch with you, because I think this presidential election is going to be very critical, and I think we do have to monitor, and I think it's important that if we know information that can possibly help somebody, it is really important to share it with people. So thank you so much, Ben, and please follow Ben Meisalis, Midas Touch Network. Incredible work, and I love the honesty, and I'm so thankful that you believe in sharing the raw data, because you actually believe in people to make the best decision once they know the truth. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks, Nessa.